Hello and welcome to the live podcast, Win More on Purpose. Today we have Yankel Meislin with us on turning the worst into the best, how to find strength, purpose, and success in life's toughest moments. The agenda, for those of you who are new, it's going to be a conversation between me and Yankel. We're all here learning together. Write down those questions. There will be a Q&A at the end, and there will be a special offer for those who stay to the end, so please stay tuned. Just some stats about the podcast from Spotify for Creators on our inaugural year. We have been streamed in 12 countries to date. We've made it into the top 15% of video podcasts on Spotify. The podcast has been a 5-star rated podcast. And according to 90 plus people, we're at a top 10 podcast, a top 5 according to 68, and are the number 1 show for 22 listeners. And we even made it onto an official top 100 sales podcast list. I just want to say a thank you for everyone who's listening to this podcast, making this an amazing first year. We would not be here without you listeners. So thank you very, very much. You could put into the chat as we are live where it is that you're coming from, what it is that you're focused on in your business, or you can just introduce yourself, what it is that you do, where you're coming in from today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Yaacov Steinberg. I'm a sales coach and have been a full-time sales coach now for 5 years. When I first started, I noticed that people were able to build 6-7 figure business on their own. They're good at what they do. They're passionate. Some put along the way they learned how to speak to people, but they hit this glass ceiling. Either it was because they were making it up as they went along and it's only going to work so far, or because they didn't want to be that stereotypical used car salesperson, sleazy, pushy, getting people to buy things they didn't even feel that they needed. And that's where I came into the picture. Mindset, techniques, skills, really helping people to have that confidence and clarity to know who they needed to speak to, where to find them, what to say, how to say it. And thankfully, we've been able to help quite a number of people that are pretty well known on LinkedIn, whether it be Kai Fishman, Hoodie Greenberger, Ellie Bosch, just to name a few. And the clients that have worked with us at the 6-7 figure realm have been able to grow by even 50% in the first 60 days of working with me. The clients at the 100,000 figure marker have been able to grow by 150% in the first 60 to 90 days. And people just starting out, solopreneurs, have been able to grow by even 240% in the first 45 days. Yankel, really excited to have you with us today. Tell us a little bit about yourself and let's get this show on the road.
First of all, thank you so much for having me, Yaacov. I appreciate it. So I am also a life and business coach, similar to you. I don't specialize in sales. I specialize in helping conflicted achievers. What is a conflicted achiever? Good question. Conflicted achievers are people who are misaligned with the things that they say that they want and the actions that they put out into the world. So one of my specialties is finding that misalignment through having conversations and helping people to align themselves with what it is that they truly, truly desire.
Wow, that is definitely exciting, and it's definitely a part of what we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that, in discussing the podcast, you and I had spoken about was usually when I, do these podcasts, I don't really get so much into the interview style of things, but I think that your story is so unique and so important to the topic that we're going to discuss today. I wanted to start off by asking you, what is the most significant tragedy that you faced, and how did it initially impact your perspective on life?
Okay, great question. So, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, and that's kind of the topic of what we're going to discuss, I have faced quite a few different tragedies in my life, I guess, or what you could consider to be tragedies. So, for people who don't know my story, I grew up in a non-religious Jewish home, became a pretty successful drug dealer. I had a bodyguard and a few employees until my bodyguard ended up turning on me. I got stabbed at one point. My life was in serious danger and I had to leave the New York tri-state area for my own safety. That was a pretty significant tragedy, if I had to say. And then I started over in Florida, where I went to rehab, and in there I found Yiddishkeit and became attached to Chabad Hasidism, and started again in Israel, where I went to yeshiva, married a woman who didn't speak the same language as me, so that was a new beginning, and then failed miserably at making my way through the Israeli business world, or whatever you want to call it, and came back to America. Had to start again from scratch, living in my parents' basement for the first 6 months that we came here, and that was a pretty big tragedy. And then reaching the height of my Safras career, which is what I had been doing, and then realizing that, like, I can't go any further with this, and now I have to start over again. So I became a coach. So any pick your poison from any one of those that I just mentioned could be considered, pretty significant life changes. Some of them were more tragic than others, but any of those.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, I've heard your story, and it's a very inspirational story. In how you went from being a top tier drug dealer in the tri-state area to being a coach who helps people live their best lives. And I think that it's a tremendous transformation that'll really lay the foundation, I think, for the conversation today. But at what point did you see the possibility of a gift within these different tragedies? Right? Was it a gradual thing? Did it happen in a moment? Was it an epiphany?
So before, there was a point at which I became aware that I can choose how I want to view a particular tragedy. Prior to becoming aware of having that choice, it was almost always in hindsight, right? Like, at the time
Right.
that I had to run away from my own business because my life was in jeopardy, I didn't feel like this was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Of
However,
course.
10 years down the line, when I found out that all the people that I had worked with had died from overdoses or whatever other means, it became pretty clear that this was, in fact, the best thing that ever happened to me, right? But at a later point, much later on, when it became clear that there is a choice to be had, that is when I started to take a more active role in finding the gift within the negative situation, whatever that may be. I mean, it could be even a small thing, and it could be a big thing, but realizing that that was a choice to be had is something that I started to take an active role, and then the outcome started to change.
Yeah, and I think it's a very important point because hindsight's 2020, right? When we're looking back, a lot of times it's easy to see the different life circumstances that led us to where we are today or led us to a certain point in time. But I think that many times in the moment is a real gift if you can understand in the moment this is a turning point, right? And if you can realize, as you're talking about, that it's a gift within the quote unquote tragedy of the moment, then that's, I think, an even deeper stage that I would say most people don't have the opportunity to actually build the muscles even to get to that point.
Hmm. That's a really good point, and it certainly is a lot about practice. Like, if you want to get good at anything, right? What is the thing that everybody says to do? You have to practice it, right? If you want to be a good salesman, I'm sure you tell people, you have to. This has to be something that comes off of you almost automatically because of the amount of times that you've practiced it. If you want to go to the MBA, you don't just wake up one day and you're there. You have to, there is a process to get there, and that is also true of recognizing the gift within a bad situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I would even take it a step further and I would ask, what role do you think mindset plays in transforming the pain into purpose.
So you know the analogy of if you leave your house and you're looking for a red car and all of a sudden you start to see red cars all over the place. The reason
Mm-hmm.
for that's a truism, or whatever you want to call it, the reason that that's true is because when we are training our mind to find something specific, we are essentially unconsciously looking for it, right? So if you have
Right.
trained your mind to unconsciously look for a gift, even in the worst of situations, you will find it. The converse is also true,
Hmm.
right? If you are looking for the negative of any situation, then that is indeed what you will find.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think that that makes a lot of sense actually when you delve a little deeper, because a lot of what we focus on, right? It's when you think good, it'll be good, right? And it's when you focus on whatever you're focusing on, that becomes to a certain degree the reality that you're putting yourself in.
100%. And I love that you put in a Hasidic quote there. Thank
It's
you.
even a Chabad quote, I believe.
It is, yes.
um. Okay, so I guess the next question would be is how do we balance honoring the pain of a tragedy while searching for that hidden lesson, right? How do you balance the two?
Yeah, so that's a really great question and a very important point. I think that some people misconstrue grief with something negative. Because I mean, the fact of the matter is that grieving is a feeling that is not particularly positive. At least it doesn't feel that way while you're going through it.
Right.
However, it's really, really important to the process of being able to get to the other side, right? So grief is totally valid and needs to be felt in order to get to a true gift on the other side of that. But grief is also a very particular emotion set, and not to be misunderstood with like depression. It is not the same. And I think that's where people kind of jumble the two, and it looks and feels very similar, but one is going to lead you down a very negative path and one will lead you down a healing path. So if you allow yourself to grieve, you have the opportunity, once that grieving period is over, to make it to the other side of finding the gift, even in the worst of tragedies.
In other words, if I'm understanding this correctly, the grieving process itself is more like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly at the end of its process of transformation, whereas the concept of depression is someone who's just stuck in the mud without the ability to pull themselves. I mean, they have the ability to pull themselves, but they see that they don't have the ability to pull themselves out of it, and they're just there. They're just in the mud.
That's a great analogy, and I'll even add a story to that if you don't mind. I
Please.
think there's an organization called Dare, I think, which is, I think, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, something of that nature. And the way that that
Mm-hmm.
organization was started was because there was a young woman who was killed by a drunk driver, and her mother, decided, after she had finished grieving for her, that she wanted her life to mean something more than just killed by a drunk driver statistic. So she created this group that goes around and what's the word? Educates people on the dangers of drunk driving and what can happen and the grief that it causes, right? But on the flip side, had she slipped into a depression, there's absolutely no way I could think of that somebody in that state would have the courage to start up a group like that ended up having such a major impact.
Right. Yeah, and I guess it leads to the question of what are the different practices or tools that have been that you've been able to cultivate or learn that help you or your clients in reframing these difficult situations that can lead to a grieving process as opposed to a depression?
I think the absolute most important is to have to train yourself to have the ability to slow down your mind. The reason why, in my humble estimation, people spiral into these sabotaging states is simply because their mind is moving at such a fast pace that they cannot keep up with it, and the, I guess, natural state of our minds, unfortunately, it kind of leads us down a more negative path, as the like just naturally. And so you don't even realize that you're kind of slipping into a very deep slope. But if you have the ability
Right.
to slow your mind down to the point where you now are more in control, let's say, or have the ability to choose, then you can choose which path you want to go or which slope you would like to ski.
Right. I guess it's kind of like the idea that there's many more muscles that are required to smile than to just keep your face stagnant or to even frown, right? Because positivity takes work, right? It's not something that we can just do automatically, right? Our automatic state is not one of necessarily positive or negative, but it's a lot easier to fall into the negative than it is the positive. Is that right?
You nailed it.
Awesome. Um, would you say that there are common themes or patterns that you've noticed in people that are have been able to have successfully turned tragedies into gifts, or it's not necessarily something that you have been able to, that like people have that trait?
I don't think that it would be possible to make a predictor of it, because you only know whether or not it's innately in you once you have experienced something traumatic or tragic. So
Hmm.
not necessarily do you can you say for sure that everybody has it in them. However, I think, as a general rule, people are very resilient, and that is one of the great traits of humanity, is that we have a will, an inherent will to live, and even deeper, like if you take uh what was his name's work, Viktor Frankl's work. We have an inherent desire for purpose and meaning, and
Hmm.
that is something that really helps to push someone on the other side, to get to the other side, is to find a meaning in the tragedy.
Wow, very deep to say the least. Um, I guess the next question would then be is how do we help ourselves or how do we help someone else move past the feeling that sometimes can come up of victimhood when faced with a difficult situation or adversity? Because from my own experience, even, and from watching people around me, a lot of times it's very easy to have ourselves look at ourselves within the situation as a victim, and many times that victim mentality leads to a situation where, oh, I'm stuck, right? As opposed to when you can move past that feeling, you actually are able to lead yourself down a path of, I guess, like you mentioned earlier, an example could be a grieving period or being able to move past the situation and see that it's the situation isn't everything.
Yeah, that's a loaded question, and it's difficult to really it's difficult to really judge that on a general basis, I would say, because some
Hmm.
people, you need to kind of shake them and say, "Hey, look, dude, you are in a victim state right now, and that is why you're feeling stuck, and that is why you are, like moving your tires in the snow and not going anywhere. Other
Right.
people, on the other hand, there are some people who need to be heard in order for them to then hear that message. So it depends on a given situation, and I guess you have to kind of know the person to whom you are um, dealing with. What type of motivation do they need to get out of this? However, that is all to say that I don't find victimhood a particularly useful tool, although we love to use it on numerous different occasions, and it's so
Right.
easy to slip into that habit. But it's not. If we really were to examine it, it's not. It doesn't really serve us on a like on any level, really.
Yeah, and I guess I've seen that myself in the sense that when we do get into that victim mentality, it just means that you're shackled, right? You're tied down. There's really nothing that can be done about the situation. This is the situation. It just is. As opposed to when we're able to move past that victimhood and we're able to see the situation in a more, I guess, objective format, more from a third party, view of the situation and see, okay, this is the situation. Maybe what advice would I give to someone else who is going through this? Or how do I look at the situation maybe from a different perspective? Then all of a sudden now, as opposed to a problem finding mindset, you're a solution based mindset, which will lead to a path of growth within the situation, but also just getting past the situation, even if we're not looking for growth, right? It's just getting through it. It's getting to the other side.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think a very powerful and undervalued tool that people have is a mirror, in a sense. Because when you say to somebody what they said to you, you say it back to them, and then they start to hear how it sounds. All of a sudden, they don't really like the way that it sounds, and then they can sort of like realize first, wait a second, am I really a victim in this situation, or do I
Right.
really want to be a victim in this situation? Can I get myself out of it? And usually the answer is in some way, shape, or form, yes, you can. Unless you're being actively victimized in this moment, you can.
Right. Is there a specific type of advice that you have seen has helped people when, let's say, they feel sometimes the tragedy might be just too overwhelming to ever lead to anything positive that you've been able to give them that can help them? Or is it like you mentioned earlier that every situation might be different?
Well, it, it's two things that I found really, really help. One is consciously slowing down the mind. That what I would start with first. And then after that, asking a very simple question: how can we make this horrible thing the best thing that ever happened to you? And then all of a sudden, one idea comes out and two ideas come out. And when you're in that slowed down state, there are infinite possibilities of what could happen from this particular, not this particular horrible thing that happened. And who knows where that could end up leading to.
Right. And just to make sure that I understood what you said earlier and what you mentioned just now, when you say slow down your mind, it's more just taking a minute to take that step back, right? It's whether it's meditation or whether it's just breathing and just not getting caught up in the moment and moving at 100 miles an hour. That's what you mean when you say that, right?
I do mean that. And yeah, in a deliberate way, to deliberately choose to slow your brain down, just as if I was to deliberately choose to slow my breathing down. We do have the ability to do that with our brains. It's just
Right.
a lot of times it's working on autopilot, and you know, we don't really think about it too much.
Right. Yeah. Um that makes a lot of sense. I think I want to take a little bit of a turn for a moment. I know that forgiveness is very important within the process of transformation, and for grieving as well. what role would you say does forgiveness of oneself or others play in the process of transforming pain?
I've never seen anyone be able to climb up a very steep mountain with a bag of rocks on their shoulder that they're carrying around with them and actually reach the top. It's very, very difficult to do that. And why would you want to if you knew that you had the choice of doing so? I mean, sometimes it feels really, really good to hold on to grudges and be angry with people, and definitely with yourself. I just don't see the value in, life is hard enough as it is. Like, why would you want to be carrying a bag of useless, valueless rocks and just keep adding them as you're trying to climb up and making it that much harder for yourself? So if you truly want to get to the, your next level, it's imperative to kind of clean the slate.
Yeah, and I guess there's a saying that I remember hearing when I was younger, which was when it came to forgiveness, one of the things that I remember hearing was that why would you give someone real estate in your mind rent free,
Yeah.
right? If
Also,
they've got space, they should be paying for it, right?
mm,
They're not going to be paying for it, so you might as well let go because sometimes, and I would even say maybe most of the time, when we're forgiving someone else, it's more for us than it is for them. Forgiveness isn't necessarily condoning someone else's behavior. We're just letting go of those actions because it's not going to get us anywhere to hold on to it.
it seems like a major theme that's kind of underneath the surface is letting go of things that don't serve, because that could manifest itself in a whole bunch of different ways. But for whatever reason, we people like to carry around a lot of stuff that doesn't actually serve us, and that may be the thing that's stopping you from getting to where you really want to go.
Yeah, I mean, I would even ask, like, what do you think holds people or most people back the most from seeing these, opportunities within their challenges? Would you say that it's forgiveness is a part of that, or would you say maybe it's something else?
I think that uh, many people have a tendency of not wanting to look in those places that are really painful to look at. And so they
Mm.
keeping the status quo is easier in a certain way than really doing, digging and figuring out and forgiving and moving on, and the freedom of being a creator as opposed to being a victim. All of those things require a certain process that is really scary and hard to do, I guess. And it's easier to just keep the status quo as it is.
Yeah, I mean, we speak about this all the time in sales. I mean, change is hard, right? At the end of the day, it's uncomfortable. There needs to be a big enough need that's gonna require me and make it make sense for me to make that change. And a lot of times, just hiding our heads in the sand and ignoring what's really going on is just the easier thing to do. Like I tell people all the time, therapy, which is extremely important, um, part of going through the transformational process many times. It's not for the faint of heart, right? People look at therapy as this like, oh, he's going to therapy, right? To the contrary, right? That person going to therapy is one of the strongest people that you probably know, right? Because they're willing to look those situations and those things that happen to them in the eye and say, I'm not going to let this define me. I'm going to try to look at the situation and see a different perspective on it. Maybe I wasn't really the victim there and I could look at it in a way that's going to lead to growth like we're talking about here, which is a completely different, way of having those occurrences sitting in your mind.
Totally agree. I totally agree with everything you just said. And that is kind of what makes the difference between somebody who I'm sitting across from and is successful at, this relationship versus somebody who is not. Because if you don't want to look, then it's going to be really, really hard to change what the situation as it is now to something different.
Right. I'm curious. I think another question that I had, thought about was how can gratitude coexist with grief, right? And I would even add to that why, in my mind, it's an essential part in turning a tragedy into a gift. But why do you feel that it is that way?
How would you define grief?
In my mind, grief is the process whereby you internalize a situation or something that's going on or something that has happened, I guess I should really say, because it's usually you grieve after something that has happened and you process that occurrence, that happening, whatever it was.
So I think that in order to in order to not have the grief turn into a depression, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
gratitude is a really big part of like the bridge between the grief stage and the gift stage. So without having that in between, like there are even let's just say, God forbid, no, let's just say a person in the world grandparent passed away. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
obviously tragic situation. There's, they were close to them. There's grieving going on. However, at the same time, there is also a gratitude of all the time that you got to spend with that person, and that can
Right.
lead to the gift of um, internalizing the lessons that you learned from that grandparent. Let's say, as an example of what we're discussing here.
Yeah, I think that really does answer the question because I mean, I can even think back on my own experiences with that specific example. One of the things that I think has really helped define or helped me to be the person that I am today is my grandfather. Um, he passed away when I was in high school, the end of high school. And I'll never forget, he always said that your word is your bond, right? And that was something that I took to heart, right? You're a man of your word is your bond. That means if you say something, you should do it. Right. And you could take that to the extreme, right? I would be careful. I was a teacher for many years, and my students at this point have children of their own. But when some of my students would invite me to an occasion, if I wasn't able to come, I wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm going to try to come." If I wasn't going to try to come, I wasn't going to say, "I'm going to try to come." I'll be there with you in spirit, or we'll see what happens, or depending on the situation. But it's about being careful with how you say things, right? And that comes from this example that you just mentioned. When looking back at the different lessons that I had learned from that grandparent and the different things that I was grateful for in that relationship, I was able to see the gifts. And I guess that's really the example that you're giving, and that's what you're saying, right? It's when you can focus on the positive by looking back, right? It's and one of the reasons, the reason we should be looking back is to see how far we've come. That's when we can have gratitude within that process to be able to find the gift to be able to move forward. Does that does that make sense?
100%. It could also be gratitude in the moment
Mm,
about, it doesn't have to be gratitude from looking back, although in this particular instance that lends itself
Right.
most, that's kind of the way that it would turn out. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be now my grandfather or grandmother, now the grandfather or the grandmother is at peace. They
Right.
were suffering and now they're at peace. So it could be also a present tense.
Right. Yeah, I think I can hear that. That makes sense. So a lot of times it's not necessarily when we're looking back, but it could even be in the present moment within the situation itself. Um,
Because gratitude has a way of kind of having a half-life, like something that happened to me 10 years ago. So some guy 10 years ago paid me $100 to write a mezuzah for him. Great, but that $100 is long gone now. It's
right.
hard to have that gratitude for that right now in this moment about something that happened so long ago that's no longer really applicable currently.
Right. Yeah, unless there were certain circumstances around that $100 that
Eh,
still apply today.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, right? It's all in the specific situations and how we're able to look at those specific situations is where it'll apply, I guess.
And that is a result of having the ability to really slow down and not
Right.
just be speeding through everything. You could even speed through grief or completely overlook it entirely, and that is not particularly great.
Right. It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Um, how do you handle situations where a tragedy feels, let's say, meaningless or senseless, like a sudden loss? With our example.
Let's analyze for a second, maybe. I haven't really done this, but let's do it. Why not? Let's analyze October 7th.
Okay.
Senseless tragedy affecting every Jew wherever he may be in the entire world. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very difficult not to, even now, to feel anger about what happened. And there was a time when, right, like, in the immediate aftermath, that I just was very angry. Perhaps one of the, pieces of grief that I needed to go through in order to get to the other side. However, there was also a very strong part of me that didn't want to go along with that narrative because I knew that the anger would lead me to a depressive state and not
Mm.
to not really to a grieving state per se. So I combated the anger with a lot of meditation, I guess you could call it, or really, really, really slowing down my mind so that I would not allow myself to go there. And then in the end, you can see the gifts of heroes who were there and in a little bit of a different light. Like I remember not too long after the tragedy, there was this kid who was in the Nova Festival who was singing a niggin on his way. Like he recorded himself singing this niggin on the way,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just so beautiful.
Alakai Neshama.
Right. Yes, exactly. And it had a different feel to it when you're not sitting in the anger. Rather, you are looking for something different, looking for what good could this have possibly done, but in a way of like not asking that incredulously, but asking it with curiosity. What even though, we don't really know the secret ways of Hashem and why he brings
Right.
suffering to the world. But however, if we want to continue uh, uh, on a personal level and not fall into a deep depression, which is certainly possible, the whole world has turned against us in a certain way since that day, and you could definitely become depressed, or
Right.
or not, or you can look at the beauty of the unity that has sprung up between different types of Jews that didn't have it before, and other examples.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of understanding that taking that step back as well, because I think people um people process these different situations in different ways. But ultimately, I think, the point that you're bringing out is that when we're able to slow down, and we did touch on this earlier, we're able to take a second look at the situation and see it from a different angle, a different perspective, that when we're stuck in a specific emotion, we're not able to do. Right? Because when we're stuck in an emotion of anger, anger and happiness can't be together in the same moment. That can't happen. Right? It won't work. It's impossible.
They don't
Um,
coexist well. They don't play
they don't,
nicely
right.
together.
And yet, if you're able to move away or behind or take that step back to not be in that state, but instead to be in a more, like you mentioned, a curious state. So then when you see the situation, you're able to see it from a perspective, using, this young man who was on his way to the festival, and like, oh, wow. Wow, look at this beautiful soul and what he was doing on the way to the festival, which so many people could have looked at that festival in one way and then they see it in a completely different way. Right? These were people who just in their own way were trying to be closer to their source, right? To the the creator of the world. And this was a song that he was singing on the way there to bring himself closer, right? And it's a completely different perspective. It's able to touch us in a completely different way when we're open to those types of perspectives, as opposed to being stuck, like you said, in the anger or, you know, in the other emotions that will lead towards a more depressive state.
Well said.
Thank you. Um, are there specific questions that you would encourage or that you do encourage people to ask themselves when they're in the depths of a difficult situation?
Um, that's a really good question. I don't think I've ever instructed anybody to really do that on their own, but let's just say that I was for a second. Or what I would ask. I would ask, are you really a victim? Are you really? And if the answer is still yes, then let's examine that. How are you a victim? And then the deeper they go into it, the question doesn't really change. Are you a victim here? Are you a victim there? Are you a victim? And more likely than not, the more that you ask that question, the more a person has the ability to see that, in fact, no, I have the ability to choose at this point a different way, a different path, if I want to. And another question that I ask a lot of people, let's say hanging on to the anger, for example, how is that working out for you? How is that serving you right now? Is that helping you to achieve the goals that you want to achieve? Is that helping you to, have a better relationship with your spouse, with your boss, with your kids? How is that going? And usually when people are being fairly honest with themselves, they will realize that no, in fact, holding on to this is not actually useful to me or helping me to reach my goals. And sometimes the answer might be that I need boundaries from a toxic person, which is
Right.
okay. But that's different from holding on to anger.
Yeah, I mean, it's, in that specific example, it's a wholly different thing. To the contrary, right? I mean, boundaries enable us to be ourselves in a situation that might sometimes feel like it's infringing on those on who we are, our sense of self. Um, but I think that, I mean, these are very powerful questions, right? Are you really a victim, or how is that going for you when you're doing this specific action? Is that really serving you in the way that you intend for it to? It's only when we have, sometimes someone else like yourself, asking us those questions that we're able to flip on that introspective light that says, "Oh, wow, that's a great question. I'm not really sure. Okay, let me think about that for a second, right?" And then, no, I'm gonna stick to my guns. No, it really isn't. It is serving me. Okay, let's delve into that a little bit more. And all of a sudden, as 20, 30 minutes later, however long it is, all of a sudden there's a light shining from the corner that says, "Wait a minute, maybe this really isn't helping me." And I think those are very powerful questions that I can see how those could lead into those moments of epiphany that could really help someone to break through it. Um, I guess looking back, another question I would have for you is, how have your own tragedies shaped your life's work and purpose? And a bit of a loaded question, would you change them if you could?
Love it. Um, so I'll answer the second first and the first second. So
Okay.
there's a really amazing quote that I heard from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. He
Mm-hmm.
was he was falsely accused by the communist Russian government of uh, spreading rebellion among the Jews and wanted to rebel against communism, even though really what they had a problem was with his spreading of Judaism and holding, fast to the principles in which, we have served
Right.
our people for 3,000 years. So they put him into prison and he had a very difficult time there. And um, he wasn't really physically the same after he left than when he came in. So a few years later, somebody asked him the same question you asked me, would you change it? So he said, I wouldn't take $1 million to go back to that situation, but I also wouldn't take $1 million to have not gone through that situation. And that really stuck with me very
Wow.
powerfully because the fact of the matter is that even though it was absolutely horrible and he was on the verge of being executed by the government, even though that was true, it had created the person who came out on the other side of that, who was even
Right.
stronger in his dedication to spreading Yiddishkeit, and when he came to America, created what is now to the foundations of what is now Chabad worldwide today. So that was really something that struck me. And I totally agree with that 100% in my own life. I would never have gotten to where I am right now, absent every single thing that happened to me, whether it was good or whether it was not so good. And the second the first question that you asked me, um, what was it again?
How have your own tragedies shaped your life's work and purpose?
Right. So I kind of just answered that, but I'll elaborate just a little bit more.
You did.
Yeah, I mean, oh, actually, I will elaborate it even more. Through through coming out on the other side and actively looking for a gift from all of the not good things that I have been through, allows me to strengthen something within me that was absent before. So let's take a small example. Perhaps it would be fair to say that as a drug dealer, I wasn't a particularly compassionate person. But after having been stabbed and really betrayed by the very person who I paid to protect me, I learned to increase my capacity for compassion through that, because I needed to give myself that, right? Like, that is a very traumatic event that happened to me, and in order for me to heal, I needed the thing that was called that I was being called for, I think, was to increase that level of compassion that I had for myself, and then from there it can go out to others, and many
Yeah,
other such examples.
yeah. I mean, everyone has gone through, their own different, circumstances, and in my role as a teacher as well as a coach, I've definitely told people, even within my own circumstances of things that I've gone through, those things made me who I am today and led me to the path that I'm on today, because they changed the way that I saw different situations or circumstances, or the things that were going on around me, right? And that led me, ultimately to, end up in the space of coaching and helping people, in the way that I am. But even when I'm, back when I was in education, I remember there was a particular young man who thankfully now has a family, and he has children. But at the time, he was really angry at the world, and that was an understatement. Like, and one day, we would sit and we would study with each other for an hour or so every single day. And I remember one day he came in and he was just going on this rant, and I said, you know what, let's go take a walk. We're not going to get anywhere anyways, right? Let's go take a walk. Um, and at the time, I was in Jerusalem, and we were walking in the back alleys over there. And at a certain point, I grabbed him by the lapel, picked him up against the wall, and I said, "This has nothing to do with this other guy. This has to do with you. And you're in this moment, and within your past, you're hating who you are and who you used to be, and you're having a struggle putting those things together. And it's leading you to hate yourself and to hate God." Right? And it just shook him up. And a little while later, he thanked me for that moment, because it allowed him to realize that he was trying to pretend that who he used to be didn't exist. And it created a dichotomy for him that how could he exist today? Right? It was just destroying him from the inside out. And when he was ready to make peace with who he used to be, and that person led him to where he is today, as a person who strives for growth and is looking to be better than who they were the day before, it opened the pathway for him to be able to be more accepting of himself, which led to him being more accepting of others and the situations that he was finding himself in. Right. And I think that, like you said, and like the Rebbe said, right, I wouldn't pay $1 million to go back to that situation, and yet I wouldn't pay $1 million to change that situation. Because without those moments, who knows where we would be today? Okay, wow, that was unexpected. Uh, anyways, this has been fantastic. I'll open the floor to Q&A while I ask you one last question over here. But can you share a specific story? And you shared quite a bit of your story thus far, but can you share a specific story where a perceived tragedy led to an unexpected gift or transformation?
Is it okay if I use someone else and not me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, a man that I was coaching, unfortunately found himself in a marriage with a woman who had a severe mental disorder. one of those mental disorders that you can't see it on the person, but like the flip could switch in 1 second, and it could go from 0 to 60 in their house, rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really obviously struggling because at any given moment, this could just become a tremendous fight in their house from literally nothing. Like he was describing times where he would um, inflect in the wrong way in what he was saying, and that just caused a major fight, over that little small of a thing. And it got to a pretty serious state where he had to leave the house a few times, and other not pleasant things. Now, when I started working with him and we started working on the ability to really slow down. Now, lichura, or how do you say, it would seem that he was within a very tragic situation in which you could possibly legitimately say that he was a real victim, because
Mm-hmm.
it would, if he were to get divorced, he would have to leave his family, and she would probably wouldn't take that very well, and would probably say not nice things about him in the community, and his standing would be ruined, etc. And so he really found himself to be stuck. However, when he had the ability to slow down and really, really, really increase his own self compassion, he was able to then extend that to his wife, even though she was going through even though it was nonsensical what was going on. But because he increased his own self compassion, he learned to love himself so much so that he could have some left over for her, even in those really difficult moments. She started to change her own attitude, and the fighting got, much less frequent, to the extent that there would be major blowouts once a month. It became once a year. And even then, the extent of which the blowouts, um, the explosiveness became much more muted after he had learned that particular skill.
Wow. Wow. Truly powerful. Um, we don't have any questions as of right now in the chat. So what I'd like to do is two things. One, at the end of every podcast, I try to remind everybody that I have a page of notes myself. And if I was going to try to implement each and every single one of these things, I'd probably trip, fall, break my nose, and it wouldn't be a pleasant experience, to say the least, although I might find a gift there. That's not something that I necessarily want to go through. So I would like to suggest that every single person who has said notes go slow, take things one at a time, and slowly implement the things you've learned today and that you've heard about, whether it's slowing down your mind, the self-love and compassion we just spoke about, how to ask questions to yourself, and the different things as such. Go slow. Give yourself the space and the time to go through those processes. Um, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that we had a special offer for those of you who made it this far, and I hope you didn't skip ahead. You would have missed out. Tell us a little bit about that, Yankel. I know that you mentioned when we were speaking right before that you had something you wanted to give to everyone here or listening today.
So I coach men. So if you are a man who is listening to this podcast, I am offering you a gift of a free 90-minute session, no strings attached, no hidden fees or hidden agendas, to meet with me and discuss whatever it is that you would like to discuss: alignment, or finding the gift in tragedy, or whatever it is that you would love. I am extending that gift to you.
Amazing. It's truly a very, very valuable and powerful offer. So thank you very much on behalf of all the listeners that will benefit from this. And I myself, I mean, in this live podcast, we speak about things that are timely, interesting, that people can add to their skill set toolbox. And for those of you that, love today's podcast, for those of you who want to find out more, um, have questions or anything like that, you can feel free to reach out to myself. I as well, I'm going to offer a free 30-minute strategy session, no strings attached, of course, to take your sales game to the next level or whatever it might be. There is a little bit of, you know there isn't that much room, let's just say, so they go quickly. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in such a thing, grab them while it's hot. And with that, I just want to extend an absolute, you know gratitude to yourself, Yankel, for coming on today, sharing your wisdom with us. The impact, I'm sure is, even for myself, I can already feel is very large. And I'm sure that for the people who are here today or listening, in the future, will gain a tremendous amount from the insights of our conversation today. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Yaakov, for having me, and thank you for making it a elevated conversation.
Absolutely. And for everyone who's here, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for listening. And until next week, have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye bye.